Hi, Amita. I'm a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Tata Institute of Social Sciences is a premier institution of social work education in the country and social science research too. And I'm primarily a social work practitioner and teacher belonging to that school where I've taught for over 15 years.
And when did you join the India Tata Institute Fellowship Program?
Yeah, actually, as in its inaugural year, I think the most interesting part of this entire fellowship was that an announcement of this fellowship had come to me through Pukar, the ICI advisors. I had seen this. Somehow it had never struck me that I myself could apply for this program. And I kept on encouraging other activist friends because I found the idea extremely interesting, and I was encouraging several of them to apply for the fellowship.
What did you tell them about this? What were the fascinating parts?
Basically, in terms of the collaboration part and the chance that one could learn in an open-ended fashion, the theme again around urbanization and environment, which is something which attracted me tremendously. And I knew several people who were working on this theme. So I kept on recommending others. Till one day, our own director, Dr. Parshuraman, he asked me, Amita, why aren't you applying for the fellowship? And yes, I said, okay, look through the announcement again and felt that perhaps, yes, I had never thought of it that I myself could apply for this fellowship.
That's okay, you can stop.
Erin, can you turn off your phone, maybe? No, turn off your phone. Do you mind?
No, not at all. I'm sorry, I put it on silence.
I'm sorry.
No, no problem.
Take your time, take your time. It's one of those things that if you try a little too hard, you just have to keep coughing.
Yeah.
So just take a break. I want a watch, that's why.
So as I was saying, and it was by his suggestion that I actually started considering that, let me look at this again a little more seriously. And then I went a little beyond the idea. I went to the New School website. I tried to find out what was meant by the ICI fellowship. I did a little bit of reading up about China.
Was it your first time?
Yes.
Wow.
In terms of doing deliberate reading, okay, I had always been actually my very first exposure in terms of talking about China was reading about the entire health system in China under the Maoist rule and reading about the Cultural Revolution, which had fascinated me tremendously because in India and in the development field, we keep on continuously encountering this entire gap between the person who labors it out in the field and the intellectual. And there have been several experiments within the Indian context actually to bridge this gap. And to which then the idea of the Cultural Revolution sounded fascinating.
In a positive way?
In an extremely positive way.
You gotta tell me more because a lot of Chinese fellows wouldn't feel the same way.
Yeah. So I started reading up a little bit about China. And then the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me it was at a good time. I applied with a good sense of confidence.
And
I knew my limitations. Right. See, because as I said, I'm a person who has a very strong emphasis on practice. And if one is talking about practice, then one has to be connected to the grassroots in many, many myriad ways. I had therefore actually never placed much importance on writing, on doing the entire conference network and establishing those kinds of contacts. My aspirations for my career were more in terms of seeing what is the difference that I can make to my students' lives and to people that I'm working with. So actually speaking, this international circuit has not held many attractions for me. So I knew those limitations, but which I didn't regard as many limitations. In terms of writing also, I kept on waiting for that lightning of wisdom to come to me before I thought I could be able to write. So, I mean, these are just facets of my personality, I would say. But I had begun writing, and I had received quite good acclaim for whatever I had written. My pieces were published in international journals. But as I said, give it limits.
Can we go back to China a little bit, and then we go back, let's talk a little bit about your
Fine.
practice, and then how, in your own career, coming into the ICI Fellowship has meant for you. So a little bit more about China, because we wanted to know what you thought.
Okay. Yeah, so as I said, these first encounters with China were more from the point of view of the positive side, the barefoot doctors and the entire health system, the cultural revolution dimension. And the cultural revolution dimension, because as I said, yes, it is very true that in India one keeps on continuously encountering this rift. I'm going to cough again. As I was saying, in India, one keeps on continuously encountering this rift between the people who slog it out in the field and the intellectuals. This has been perpetuated by the kind of caste system that we have. In many ways, the caste system is an expression of this distinction between the dignity of labor. The Dalits and the toiling masses on one side, and whether it is in terms of income poverty or other social dimensions of exclusion, are on the lowest rungs of the ladder. And at the higher end, you have the Brahmins, who are the intellectuals of the system. And in many ways, the system has continued to privilege them, in more indirect ways perhaps, but this is the way it continues to be. And while within the entire development sector, there are several instances of Brahmins, and I myself am a Brahmin at that. Several instances of Brahmins who have been engaged in work with the underprivileged sections. Within organizations, the gap between people in the field and people who are making decisions, who are taking, is a tremendous lot. There have been several experiments in actually bridging this gap. We have tried methods of Paulo Freire. The Maoist struggle itself is very active in India. The entire Naxalite struggle, which draws its inspiration again from Mao, they call themselves Maowadis itself. There are other kinds of ways in which attaching compulsory internships to people who are intelligent. So actually several of these experimentations have been done.
In that itself, you consider as India engaging with some of the ideas coming from China.
Very sure.
And then for you, then, to start thinking about what it means now for you and engaging with China scholars.
One of the first shockers to me was during my interview of the ICI, I was asked to read this book, The Three Swans. I read it, and at that time, the turmoil of the cultural revolution somewhere, it deeply shook me, what it can be. It also raised a whole lot of questions in my mind. When we came here for the New York residency, these questions were taken to a further level altogether. Because especially in conversations with all our Chinese colleagues, the most interesting part was after even 2.5 days of our residency, not just the residency, but the retreat here in Glencoe, I think we were still moving around in circles, unable to get past who we were, what we wanted. It was like a professional relationship somewhere with some ounces of a personal introduction, but we were not really conversing with each other. And at that point, I think one of us, Partho perhaps, I think, Partho it was, he said, let's just start talking about why are we pursuing the interest that we are doing? What does it mean to us? And we started conversing along those lines. And all of us shared quite intensely. And then one of the Chinese fellows, Shabu, he began his sharing, which was like the first breakthrough, I would say. He spoke about his experiences of the Cultural Revolution, his immediate family members, the kind of exploitation. I'm using the term exploitation. He never used and referred to the term exploitation at all. Had undergone, and difficulties at what all levels a person can actually undergo. And his sharing and the subsequent sharing of other Chinese colleagues, it really shook our entire frame in many, many ways. Okay, the first thing, the experience of the Cultural Revolution itself. The second, in terms of, we began to somewhere realize where is the extreme pragmatism of the Chinese colleagues coming in. Okay, we as, I think, Indians were most strong about ideas, about theories, about ideologies, about ideals, and very quick in critiquing the government. As I'm saying, the Chinese colleagues were extremely practical, extremely pragmatic in their approach. After undergoing this kind of a trauma, Shabu was still talking about an engagement with the state, and so were the other Chinese colleagues. So what all an overwhelming presence of the state can mean, again, is something. Because for us, while all of us were working with the Indian state in some ways, we were completely free in critiquing it. So that is something which, again, as a difference in framework, really struck us very strongly. The third, the connection between the party and the government, which kept on operating at the sidelines because we didn't really talk about it. But one of the Chinese fellows was a journalist, and he came up with a very strong statement saying, Mao is a bastard. And then the response of the other Chinese friends to him and his strong statement, I mean, that was again something which was very revealing, because we kept on understanding from these frameworks. I mean, when I'm saying frameworks were shook up, it was in these fundamental ways. Because you may talk about the Indian system, the Chinese system, and so on and so forth, but these facets of how fundamentally different our contexts are is something which actually was revealed to us in these kind of interactions with each other. So that was something.
And that was new, and that was the first encounter. During subsequent, when the Chinese fellows came to India and when you visited India, China, did you feel that it was changing? How does that change?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the visit to China, I think, made some of these realizations sharper, especially about the omnipresence of the state. Secondly, I think the Chinese visit also made us realize that China is an extremely complex and extremely nuanced reality. The reality of Beijing as a city and its response is extremely different from, let's say, the cities where I did my fieldwork, Ruiyang, Wenzhou. So these are very different. Or Hangzhou, where we had another part of the residence. So all of these city governments were extremely different in their profiles, in their responses. Whereas in India, we have a much more centralized system. So this nuancedness is something which struck us. The other is about the difference between private cultures and public cultures, which I really found so fascinating. I have not been able to fully explore that, but these are like new things, or in India we would say these are new kidas, worms, which are now worming in my mind. like one is the observation that in China, I've seen women much more free in their attire, in their behavior, extremely liberal. But if you look at their public representation in advertisements, in movies for that matter, on television, which is mostly state supported, you do not see, or rather you would see very little presentation of the woman's body, uncovered presentation of the woman's body. Whereas in India, I think because we are sold onto this idea of capitalism, the commercial way, we would see women much more conventional and conservative in their attire and public behavior, whereas advertising displays a woman's body like it's
So it's reversed.
extremely reverse. So that's again another nuance which I realized only on visiting China. This is something which we had never talked about at all. The dimension also about the pressures that are created when both men and women work, and the extremely divisive impact that it has on the families. Because all over in Chinese newspapers, in Chinese media, and the realities around us, the Chinese colleagues' realities for that matter, families are divided. So that's like one of the realities of their lives.
What do you mean by divided?
Parents are in the urban area, the children are educated somewhere else, or they are with their grandparents in the villages, or there is a husband here and the wife and the children are in some place else. So these realities of divided families is something which is very real in China. So these are things which again had not struck us, or I mean during the entire conversations around China.
And with some of these observations, when you went back to India, has it made any impact on the way you see Indian society or the way you work in the field?
Actually, 2-3 things which I would like to say is, one, in the last 1.5 years, one of the most critical things, developments in India has been the entire push towards urbanization and the push towards the special economic zones, which is again an experiment which was carried out in China. Okay. When I say Chinese nuanceness, one of the most interesting realizations that I had was that the rush to initiate a special economic zone policy within the entire country in extremely centralized fashion, uniform fashion in the country, which creates so many issues in a country like India. Whereas the Chinese policy is one of experimenting, trying it out, expanding it in bits, parts, revising it, and then applying it as a perhaps a uniform policy. But even within that, there is a tremendous degree of diversity. Whereas in India, the tendency is to apply it in an extremely standardized fashion, and we are not predicting the outcomes at all. So I had made this entire presentation on how can one apply the Chinese experience of SEZs, because then I followed it up with much more reading. We had had a few encounters with SEZ regions in the Chinese residency, but I followed it up with some more reading and did a presentation around the governance issues pertaining to the SEZs and how some of those dimensions could also be carried out. Because again, the experience of how within India, the kind of SEZ policies that we have are somewhere letting go of the reins of the state to the private sector also. Whereas in China, privatization is there, but the state is firmly holding the reins of including the SEZ regions, its labor, everything. They are in control. Whereas we are letting go of some of these controls in the Indian case. And perhaps we may have very few spaces left to operate and to exert.
So you find the way the Chinese model would possibly work better in India?
I think yes, some of these are definitely lessons that we can definitely take from them. in terms of a much more strategic thinking. I wouldn't take the entire thinking because, like for example, when it comes to slums, myself and Yang Yao, one of the Chinese colleagues, we did this project on education. Okay. But fundamentally, what really shook me was when we visited one of the schools, his focus was on the school and the education project. I started asking about how the school was initiated at all. How does it exist? And realizing that there are migrant settlements, there are migrant schools, there are migrant children, and there are migrant teachers. And the people who initiate these are also entrepreneurs, migrant entrepreneurs. So it's like almost a self-help entrepreneurial system, which one is calling an NGO. In the Indian context, it is very different. Also, while walking out in some of these settlements, I realized that there were some mounds of sand. And I asked the headmaster, what were these? And he said, the people who stay over here, their hukos not belong to BG. So as a result, if they die, they have to be buried here illegally.
So these are
again something which really shook me. Because in India, you have a system which is legally in many ways open to everyone, accessible to everyone. In practice, there are several impediments and several barriers to access. Okay. You have a Chinese system which gives the impression of gradual opening, but its closure is very, very great. No? So one needs to look at this in a very different way, because you may not be asking the questions at all. Here, educational provision then seems to be much better. The migrant schools over here, which are self-help solutions, are much better than the state-provided municipal schools in India. But our poor don't have to be buried like that.
Well, you also, the way you mentioned your work with Yao Yang, the kinds of questions he asks is different than the kinds of questions you ask. Well, he's an economist, of course, and you're a social worker. Yes. And what is it like to work with someone who looks at things much more abstractly?
Interesting. See, and I would say it has not just been, because in many ways, I think Yao Yang's project and my project also captures the thinking of the group. So to me, it is not just a collaborative project between him and me, because this has been the central theme of our entire engagement. So we have had discussions around democracy in China, in India. So the debate has continued among all of us fellows. So there are several contributories to this coming from extremely varied perspectives. Okay. But I would just say, yes, between an economist and a social worker too, yes, there are tremendous differences. I tend to come from the people side, he tends to come from the fact side. I think the systems, the very social or the politico-economic systems from where we are coming also bring in a certain kind of a difference.
What is this third entity that you guys created? What is this third entity that you created, you think?
In terms of a disciplinary name, I don't know.
Any kind of this, how would you describe this third entity?
Actually, if you look at the entire article, to me, it is still like a collage. I don't think the disciplines have merged together, but we are asking the same questions, and I think that itself is very important. If you look at the entire Ruyan case study, which he has presented, and the Dharavi case study, which I have presented, mine, I would say, is much more ethnographic in its approach. His is statistical in its approach. Yeah. So I don't think there is a complete marriage which has happened here. It's not a union of perspectives, but it is a collage. It is in terms of two disciplines at least being able to relate to each other.
But do you think that that is part of the fellowship in that sense?
Definitely so. Definitely so. No, there are others with whom one would find, for example, I met Partho Mukhopadhyay through this residency. I would say Partho is an economist wearing a completely different hat.
What would you say to the Cohort 2 fellows?
Yeah.
If you, now that they're starting the fellowship now, what would you say to them in terms of your advice?
Advice that would make me to be a very wise person, which I'm not. Yeah, I just hope that the relationships have some space to deepen. Like many a time I felt that our residencies were a little too packed, and while they were very interesting exposures, the space to work out things in a free manner was somewhere limiting.
What kind of spaces would you like to have?
More in terms of time, I think, for people to talk to each other, and actually the fellows to have uninterrupted time. I see that in this case it has been included now. The time at Glencoe is much more and much freer now than what we had last year. So I think definitely that is something positive. No, but we found this entire thing last year of arriving at projects a little too sudden, and we really didn't have time to fully converse with each other, and that will take time, especially if the idea of a true collaboration is to emerge. See, otherwise collaborating only around your own specific interests, collaborating only around your own discipline, I think is fairly easy. If you will see that within our cohort, none of these relationships have been straight in that sense.
Straight in what?
Straight as in, the Chinese economist has not worked with the Indian economist, or me from the development practice field has not, I don't know who I could have worked with, but whatever else. There were two planners here, there were no planners here. So if you look at actually disciplines, we were extremely mismatched fellows. But that was, I think, also the beauty of the thing.
That they were, disciplines were very different,
Yes.
and you were matched.
I think I perhaps must have taken a great risk also in bringing all of us together, because we were really varied, very varied in terms of levels at which we were pitched, the levels at which we had worked, the disciplines, the backgrounds, everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what put us together was that, yes, I think what I have experienced from all my fellow colleagues is the relative openness to work with each other.
That sounds very nice. That sounds fantastic. That sounds very nice. Stop. What do you think?
That was great. It was very relaxing.
Okay. Is there
And cameras rolling and action.
Is there anything else you would like to say for us? Any last words?
Is that the question? What last words? No, sorry. I don't know what to say any last words now. No, actually, I feel that what the ICI is attempting is extremely ambitious. I hope there would be more of such open programs. I think the beauty of the entire thing is its open-endedness, and we fully use that. Perhaps also extended that a little bit.
Would you want to eventually work in China for a little bit?
At least in terms of certain research interests, yes, I'm very, very sure I would like to establish some ties.
That's great. That's great. That's great.
I've not fully explored that, but yes, I will. Rather, now it has kind of provoked my interest not just in China also, but I also want to look at some of the African economies. Basically, in terms of understanding now poverty from varied systemic perspectives and how states respond. That's a new area which I'm really getting very intrigued with, and I want to understand.
Thank you. Thank you. That's definitely going to happen. Thank you very much.